Welcome back. My guest today is Jack Mintz, economics professor, advisor to national and international economic bodies, author, and public policy expert. Now, Jack, we haven't seen great economic data lately. It looks we're certainly seeing a slowing in the economy, and the OECD mentioned the OECD earlier, and they predicted that Canada will have the lowest growth rate of all of the developed countries for decades to come. Now, that presumes, of course, that nothing substantially changes. We've also seen terrible productivity data. And of course, productivity is so vital to any economy. And that directly affects the standard of living of Canadians. And this is a lot of, I think, what's Canadians being quite disgruntled right now because they're really feeling it in their own lives. This is a pretty big condemnation of our current economic path. And what, in your view, are the priority things that need to change so that we don't realize this fate that the OECD is predicting for us?
Well, I think I've actually just written an article this past week on on Canada's falling standard of living, and this would be a very unfortunate legacy for the current prime minister. If that's what he's going to be known for is making Canada poor, and that's really what's been happening. We've had no growth in real per capita GDP since 2017, unlike the United States, for example, which has gone up over 10% during that period. And so it just reflects really what's been happening here. We're falling behind, and I think this is going to be very serious. So what to do about it? I think we need to focus more on the things that we are not doing very well in. And I think just about every economist would agree that our private sector investment has been dismal in the past number of years, and as a result, we're not getting the kind of growth that we need from what's called capital deepening, so that labor can be producing a lot more relative to the number of people that we hire. And we are having shortages in labor as well because of various mismatching in markets. But I think the real key issue is the lack of private sector investment. And so we do need tax reform, regulatory reform, the sort of things that I mentioned before.
Yes, absolutely true. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, we can't seem to get anything done in Canada. And of course, investors go, I'm not going near that. They don't like that kind of uncertainty. Now, we know a federal budget's coming up on April 16th, not too far away. And Finance Minister Freeland has claimed that she's going to meet the fiscal targets that they've set out earlier, and that the deficit it will come in, as they predicted, at around $40 billion. Still a big deficit. Many economists, however, expect it to be a lot higher than that. What are your thoughts about where federal finances are headed in the upcoming budget?
Well, I think we have to remember that that a $40 billion deficit is a lot more meaningful today than it was even before the pandemic. The federal government said they weren't going to allow deficits to go up above 10 billion when they first got elected in 2015. And then, of course, those deficits started growing. And then they said, well, we're not going to focus on the deficit. We're going to keep our debt, GDP, our debt burden down, the amount of federal debt relative to GDP. But of course, every time something bad happens and the debt GDP ratio goes up, then all of a sudden, the government is saying, oh, well, we're going to still keep that down, but we're not going to go back to where we were in the first place. We're just going to keep letting it rise. And of course, after the pandemic, there was a very sharp rise in federal debt as a share of GDP, and it's not coming down. And in fact, it keeps rising. And I think that's because we are getting far too much spending. And it's showing up in, for example, the huge increase in employees at the federal level, which has been 40% since 2015. That's just one example. The amount of business subsidies that are being thrown out the window are just absolutely huge. And so I think there is a real need to take the scalpel to federal spending, but we're not going to see it in this budget.
Yeah. What is the current debt to GDP ratio federally?
Well, I have to go back to my numbers, but I think it's around 40 or 50%.
Yeah.
When it was down to 30%. And so even a little bit less. And so it has increased quite a bit. But we also have to remember that the provinces and the municipalities are also, especially the provinces, are carrying a lot of debt as well. So when you put all levels of government together, total gross debt in Canada as a share of GDP is now over 100%. We haven't been at that level since well before, let's say, back in the early 19th or the late in the 1980s when the federal government was running up debt at that point.
Yeah, and that, of course, was not too long after that. We had our debt crisis in Canada, where suddenly things had to be cut rather abruptly and quickly. We have to take another quick break now. You are watching Canadian Innovators.